Your mind is supposed to guide you, protect you, and help you make sense of life. But what if I told you that your mind is lying to you every single day? Most of the thoughts you believe, most of the fears you carry, and most of the doubts you listen to are not truth. They are illusions. The mind has a way of creating stories that keep you safe, or at least make you feel safe. It whispers, "You're not ready. You'll fail. People will judge you, and it's too risky." And because these lies sound like your own voice, you believe them without questioning. But what's the cost of listening? You give up opportunities, you shrink your dreams, and you live a life far smaller than what you were created for. The mind's lies aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're subtle, like convincing you to delay, to wait for the perfect moment, to prepare just a little longer. And slowly, silently, your life passes by. This is the greatest trick of the mind. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't break you in one blow. It kills you in tiny doses of hesitation and self-doubt. If you've ever felt stuck, trapped, or unable to move forward, the truth is, it's not life holding you back. It's the lies you've been believing from your own mind. The mind lies because it is wired for survival, not truth. Its number one job is to keep you alive, even if that means keeping you small, scared, and stagnant. Think about it. Your ancestors survived by being cautious, by overthinking dangers, by assuming the worst. That same mechanism still runs inside you today. So when your mind tells you, "Don't try, don't speak up, don't take risks," it isn't speaking truth. It's recycling old survival codes. But here's the problem. Survival is not the same as living. The mind confuses comfort with safety, but in reality, comfort zones are prisons. Every time you obey the lie that says, "Stay where you are, don't change, don't move," you are slowly suffocating the deeper part of you that craves growth and freedom. The mind's lies feel real because they are coated with emotion. Fear feels real. Doubt feels real. But feelings are not facts. Your mind can convince you that people don't care about you when in fact they do. It can convince you that failure is fatal when in fact it's the path to success. It can convince you that you're not enough when in truth you are far greater than you realize. The mind is a brilliant storyteller, but it doesn't always tell the story of truth. The question is, will you keep believing its lies, or will you step beyond them into reality? The greatest danger of a lying mind is not just that it holds you back. It makes you believe the cage you live in is freedom. When you accept every thought as truth, you stop questioning, you stop exploring, you stop growing. Your mind tells you, "This is who you are," and you accept it without challenge. But what if your mind is wrong? What if the limits you believe in are not real limits at all, but fences built out of fear? The human mind can create prisons stronger than iron walls. It convinces you that your past mistakes define you, that your failures prove your weakness, and that your future is already doomed. But these are illusions, not truths. Your mind doesn't show you reality. It shows you a filtered version of reality, one painted with fear, insecurity, and old memories. This is why two people can face the same situation, and one sees opportunity while the other sees disaster. The difference is not the world outside, it's the lies inside. Once you recognize that your mind is not always a trustworthy guide, you begin to reclaim power. You begin to see that you are not the voice in your head, you are the awareness listening to it. And that awareness is free, unchained, and connected to something far greater than your own thoughts. Escaping the lies of the mind does not mean silencing it completely. It means learning to see through it. The first step is awareness. When your mind tells you you can't, pause and ask, is this truth or just fear? When it whispers, you'll fail, ask, has failure ever truly destroyed me, or did it actually teach me? This questioning breaks the spell. The second step is practice. The mind is like a muscle. It grows in the direction you train it. If you constantly feed it with negativity, doubt, and fear, it will keep lying to you. But if you train it with truth, courage, and action, it begins to serve you instead of control you. The third step is silence. In silence, you discover the difference between the noisy lies of the mind and the calm truth of the heart. The heart does not lie. It knows, it feels, it connects directly to reality and to the divine. This is why moments of meditation, prayer, and deep reflection are so powerful. They pull you out of the storm of thoughts and back into the center of truth. The lies of the mind lose their power when you stop obeying them. When you act despite fear, when you speak despite doubt, when you move despite hesitation, you prove the mind wrong. And every time you prove it wrong, the lies get weaker and the truth inside you gets stronger. At the deepest level, the greatest truth you can discover is that you are not your mind. The mind is a servant, a tool, a translator of reality, but it was never meant to be your master. When you mistake its voice for your identity, you live in constant fear, hesitation, and self-doubt. You accept limitations that do not exist, you carry burdens that are not yours, and you miss opportunities that were placed in your path. The lies of the mind are not always obvious. Sometimes they come dressed as logic, sometimes as caution, sometimes even as care. But when you step back and observe, you realize these voices are not the truth. They are only echoes of past conditioning, fear, and illusion. Real freedom begins the moment you stop blindly believing every thought that arises. You realize that the mind is just one part of you, not the whole of you. Behind the chatter, behind the noise, there is a deeper awareness, a presence that is calm, unshaken, and timeless. That awareness is your true self. It does not lie because it does not need to. It sees reality as it is, without distortion. The mind tries to control, but awareness simply knows. When you begin to live from this space, everything changes. Fear may still arise, but it no longer rules you. Doubt may whisper, but it no longer paralyzes you. The lies of the mind lose their power when you stop obeying them. So the next time your mind tells you you can't or you're not enough, pause and remember, that is not truth. It is only a voice. You are more than your thoughts, more than your fears, more than the illusions your mind creates. Trust the deeper voice of your heart and soul because it never lies. And when you live from that truth, you step into freedom, strength, and peace beyond anything the mind can imagine.